welcome to 4550 RPM, celebrating the lives of past musos born in the 40s and the 50s. I'm your host GK, yes, it's a pseudonym, and this is episode 3, and we're going to offer a brief overview of the life of Chris Bailey, a pioneer of the punk rock genre, a talented songwriter, and a legend of the Aussie rock scene. Now before we get into that, I just want to explain the raison d'etre, or as I heard it once pronounced on an American movie, Raisin Data, for this show. I started a long-form podcast program called Philosopher Rock, which you can find on this channel. Please remember to like and subscribe. We need you to do that so we can get some traction for the show. So we got Philosopher Rock underway, and I realised there are so many musos from the classic rock and associated era who are passing away, and I wanted to do something short and sharp that would in some way honour their memory and the contribution they made to popular music, hence 4550 RPM. Now, I have a long list of artists that I'd like to cover, and I plan to get to most of them. My biggest impediment is my own health. Please, again, if you like what I'm offering, like and subscribe and comment on this channel. I don't ask for anything else. Okay, so to Chris Bailey. Bailey's mostly known for his time fronting the Aussie band The Saints, which went through many lineups in its long history. I believe the Saints are most well loved and remembered for their contribution, indeed their pioneering, of the punk rock genre. And as we will discuss here, there is so much more to Bailey and the Saints than that. Chris Bailey was born in 1957 in Kenya to Irish parents and migrated to Brisbane, Australia from Belfast, Northern Ireland when he was 7. He founded the Brisbane band in 1973 with the guitarist Ed Cooper and drummer Ivor Hay after they met at school. They originally named their band Kid Galahad and then The Eternals before switching over to the Saints in 1974. As far as making it into the studio and recording music, there are 3 bands who laid down the foundations of punk rock music. There's the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and then there's the Saints. I can't even begin or attempt to explain just how amazing that is for an Aussie band to be at the cutting edge of a new genre. But think of it in terms of economies of scale. And of all places in Oz for them to come from, it happened to be little old Brisbane, which has always played a third fiddle to Melbourne and Sydney when it comes to original music. In fact, I could make a great argument that even Adelaide would have better known bands back in the day. I don't know how I got into that rabbit trail. Anyway, somehow, in a parallel path with the Ramones in the US, the Pistols in the UK, the Saints brought the raw sound of punk rock to Australia and then to the world. I can't even emphasise this enough. But the Saints being early to the game on the punk rock scene is a huge deal. Bob Geldof said that, and I quote, rock music in the 70s was changed by 3 bands, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and the Saints. The Saints' debut single, I'm Stranded, predated the vinyl debut of bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Now think about that, predated the Pistols. And it was released in September 1976. Now, a lot has been written about this era in Brisbane's history, but suffice it to say in those days, Brisbane was a very conservative city, and the Saints would have scared the wits out of the establishment of the day. Indeed, the police often broke up their gigs and arrested many a punter back in the day. Now, I'm not a Brisbane boy, but I spent decades living in and around Brisbane, so I have a little experience in this era and area. In fact, the band I was in moved to the region in the early 80s looking for work, and the last gig we ever played was shut down by the cops for being too loud and provoking violence. Wow, they certainly were heady days, and that's something I guess we had in common with the Saints, getting the gig shut down. Anyway, back to the Saints. Their self-released debut single, I'm Stranded, became a huge hit in the UK, and the group was swiftly signed to EMI, which released their debut album, also titled I'm Stranded. Their sound encompassed fast tempos, raucous vocals, and buzzsaw guitar that characterised the very early punk rock. After relocating to the UK, the Saints released 2 more albums, Eternally Yours and Prehistoric Sounds. The former found moderate success thanks to the single This Perfect Day, but Prehistoric Sounds failed to make much of a dent. Shortly after this, Cooper left the Saints. Now I have a connection here. I once bought something off eBay and the seller was no other than Cooper's brother. Now, isn't that something? Whew. Okay, let's move on. This early iteration of the Saints with Bailey on vocals and Cooper on guitar is for the purists the real and only versions of the Saints, and I get that. Now, I don't want to start any drama here, so bear in mind the majority of what you're going to hear here is just my humble opinion, but there is a clear delineation between the Cooper era of the Saints and the rest. Now, this rest is what I call the more commercial, less punk rock era. I mean, let's be honest, the Saints surpassed the whole punk thing by their sound and their appearance anyway. They were quite unique. Anyway, after Cooper left the band, Bailey continued to release material both under the name of the Saints and as a solo artist. There were many fine musos who passed through the band, and the catalogue has something like 13 studio albums, a couple of EPs, a couple of live albums, and a whole heap of singles. I want to talk about this post-punk era of Bailey's, so let me offer this quote from an interview, and I'll drop a link to this interview down below here. So, the interviewer asks, quote, "When I look back on the Saints stuff from the 70s until now, I notice your style and approach may not always be in step with what is going on with other forms of popular rock or in the larger rock market. It's refreshing for me because I can always count on your songwriting to be good and your material to be interesting, even when it's folky, and that's not a genre that I'm crazy about. It's always consistent." Bailey. One thing that's always appealed to me about the Saints, and as a solo artist, I have nothing against commerciality. I love fine wines and whatnot, but when it comes to making music, I found at a very early age that there are a lot of people who would be very happy to make formula music. Everything was very choreographed and they've treated it as a career. Whereas I've always been a little mad and I hate to use the word passion, but I seem to have a passion for this stuff. It's a cliche, I know, but I like rock music to be real. My timing with fads and trends has always been lousy. It also occurred to me as a young man that trends come and go rather quickly, and I think if you're lucky enough to find the core of what you do, well, then it's a lot of fun refining that. Unquote. Now, the music that Bailey made after the Ed Cooper era has elements of rock, pop, folk, blues, roots, you name it, but the ever-present factor is Bailey's unique voice, and I really think that's what drives the whole thing. If you listen to any of their stuff, I'm sure, or I hope you'll agree. Anyway, now I want to talk about some things that are going to be very subjective here, okay? So I came relatively late to the Saints scene, despite some of the parallels that I pointed out earlier with my experience in the Brisbane and Queensland music scene. My brother was a promoter back in the day, and he used to receive a fair amount of material from agencies and management and in the music scene, and often it included LPs. One day he slung me a copy of The Monkey Puzzle by the Saints, and that's the first album released after those of the punk era. That record sparked a 40-year love of the Saints for me, and the love goes on even further than that, as I'll share with you now. One thing I'll never forget is driving across the Hornibrook Bridge with my young son strapped into his car seat in the back. I was listening to the radio and Like Firewood come over the air. When it was over, my little bloke said, "Hey, I like that one." And I didn't know he'd been listening. I was just sort of driving along and he was so young, I just didn't know he was taking it in, but they do, don't they? They soak things up. And I don't recall him commenting on another song or another tune in that era when he was that young, so it really stood out to me, and it's one of my very special memories about him and me and the Saints. Another thing that makes Bailey and the Saints special to me is that they're a band that my wife and I share a common love for. Now, let's be honest, it's hard to find someone who shares that same deep passion as you for a band, and it's even more difficult to find that significant other who shares that same passion. It is very special. I'm sure many of you are going to be nodding your head as I'm saying this. Now, I understand that this section of this episode is super subjective, right? But maybe this whole episode is, I don't know. But hey, music is personal, right? Isn't it? So let's continue with the subjectivity. If you've been around for a while or listened to any of my previous episodes of anything I do, I avoid playing songs or clips so I don't run into any of that copyright stuff. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, But anyway, almost everything I have or will discuss is easily accessible here on YouTube and in other places. So I want to recommend some listening for you that lies outside of those first 3 Saints albums. Okay, now I found this pretty tough. I just love so much of Bailey's material. I will limit myself to recommending just 3 albums and 100 songs. Just kidding. Let's make it 3 albums and 5 songs. So here goes. The first album I want to recommend is the last album, King of the Sun, released in 2012. I've got the double album issue, which has the same track listings, but re-recorded with a different guitarist and drummer. So with this double, you get the original King of the Sun issue and the new version called the King of the Midnight Sun. This is one of those albums where every track is a beauty. So do yourself a favour and get your hands on a copy. And if you can't listen to the whole thing, listen to just 2 tracks off it. Listen to A Million Miles Away and Adventures in the Dark Arts of Watermelonry. You're going to thank me for it. The next album you should listen to is the 1986 release, All Fool's Day. This was the Saints' breakthrough album in the United States, with the tracks Like Firewood and Temple of the Lord getting airtime on the telly. The album is far more than those 2 tracks, and for me personally, again, one of the tracks is the inspiration for the name of my so far unregistered home movie production company, which includes me and my mobile phone. But the track you have to listen to is Like Firewood. Okay, so that's 3 tracks I've suggested so far. 2 albums, 3 tracks. Let's continue. The third album I'm going to recommend is Prodigal Son, released in 1988. It has some ripper tracks on it like Ghost Ships, which I'm sure many of you have already heard. But my 4th and 5th song suggestions are Before Hollywood and Massacre. Again, do yourself a favour, you'll thank me for it. The album also contains a great cover of the Easy Beat song The Music Goes Round My Head, which made it onto the soundtrack album to the film Young Einstein. Just as an aside here, I remember as a young bass player about to launch into the music scene, meeting Dick Diamond of the Easy Beats. He was their bass player. Anyway, we met at a gig and I just can't remember who we were there to see, but he gave me some sage advice. And the one thing that stands out to me was his recommendation about avoiding the drug scene. He said, get into music, go deep, but avoid the drugs. Okay, so there is so much from Chris Bailey's catalogue that I could recommend, but it's easier to say, get it all, listen to it all. But if you can't, listen to those 3 albums and those 5 song suggestions. So that'll do us for now, and sadly, I will finish this episode with this. Chris Bailey, singer, songwriter, guitarist, bassist and producer. It was reported that he died of natural causes, and I dedicate this episode to his memory. Chris Bailey, 29 November 1956 to 9 April 2022.